Well, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming on this summer Monday. I know we it's a big ask to be here in the summer. We really appreciate folks coming. So welcome to the PERVADE in conversation with Dr. Amandalynne Paullada. I'm Katie Shilton, and I'm the principal investigator of the PERVADE project. The PERVADE project is a 6-institution research project focused on answering empirical questions in data ethics. It's funded by the US National Science Foundation, and we're studying how people react to their pervasive digital data being used in research, how data scientists are grappling with ethics and ethical questions in their work, and how regulators such as university institutional review boards are guiding data-intensive research. And this webinar series held over the summer is meant to highlight a number of researchers who are doing cutting-edge work in data science and data ethics. And today I'm joined by Dr. Amandalynne Paullada. She's the National Library of Medicine Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And her doctoral work, completed in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Washington, focused on the societal impacts of natural language processing technologies. So Amandalynne, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to talk to you today because of your work investigating how data sets are used in machine learning research. And in particular, you've looked at how data sets are taken from one context to train models in another, and how a relatively small set of benchmarks have been valorized as appropriately measuring progress in machine learning. Can you tell me a bit about how you got into questions of potentially questionable data use within machine learning?
Yeah, so over the course of my PhD, I had a lot of sort of hands-on experiences trying to get data for a particular research question, and just kind of experiencing firsthand how difficult it is to get quality data. And once you have it, to kind of like quality check it, it's hard. And then I think simultaneously there were a lot of sort of watershed moments in natural language processing where a lot of these now ubiquitous large language models were kind of crushing existing language understanding benchmarks. And I think just out of curiosity, I was like kind of manually inspecting a lot of the language problems that these models were doing so well at. And I think I had a lot of, I guess, curiosity around how is it that, a pair of sentences can embody a particular language understanding task? Like, what is it that the models are actually doing? And also being sort of surprised at some of the quality issues within these data sets. Like there would be a sentence pair that ostensibly represents like an entailment relationship, but that even I, as like a human English speaker, was like, I'm not really sure I could even get this one right. And so, yeah, I think just kind of like, for me, observing this sort of ostensible progress, but then kind of looking at like what is actually, the foundation for all of this progress. And I think around that time, I guess this was like 2018, there were a lot of papers coming out with like data set audits that kind of pointed out the quality issues in both image and language data sets, and a lot of the ways in which models were sort of exploiting spurious cues in data. And so I think, yeah, I guess I just kind of started trying to keep track of like, what are all of the issues with data sets that lead them to be less than ideal sort of benchmarks for progress. So yeah, that's kind of how that got started.
It makes a lot of sense, like coming from your own experience and then coalescing with sort of a moment in which these questions were becoming really important to the larger field. So you've then, since having these questions, done a lot of work on thinking through choosing data sets wisely. And I wonder, now that you're on the sort of other side of your dissertation and you've done all of this research on the problems around data set use in machine learning, how do you recommend, when people ask you for advice, or when people ask you for your advice, how do you recommend that people developing machine learning systems choose their data sets? What factors should they consider? What does good data use look like?
I think I always feel very humbled if people ask me that question, because I'm like, I also don't know. I'm still kind of learning. But I think people tend to have the right idea around just looking for what is available and what is documented. Like, I think if you want to be able to train a system that you are able to understand in, deploying a new context, or if you want to be able to do, critical error analyses, you want to know what is in the training data and what are its properties. And I think like making use of available documentation or available tools that let you explore the data manually to see like what are the properties of the data set, like what are some of the what's the distribution of the labels or of the kind of features in there. Like I think that is just kind of good practice in general, and I think people should keep doing that. But yeah, I think, like I said, from my own experience, it's really hard to just find quality data in large amounts for particular research questions. Like there are increasingly resources like Hugging Face data sets that provide a really neat interface to both documentation and the data itself. But if there's a problem you're trying to solve and it's not, realized in one of those data sets, you kind of have to either start from scratch or get clever. And I think people are willing to take a lot more shortcuts in those situations because it's like, I just want to build the thing. I don't have a lot of time and I'm under this pressure to publish or to deploy something. And I think those are where it gets tricky because like, I think people are willing to sacrifice quality in those situations.
Yeah. And that's where you start to get spurious results and things like that. Yeah. And so documentation actually is really interesting as a piece of this puzzle because, you mentioned that as fairly critical, right? You want well-documented data so that you understand what's happening and what's what is in this data, right? And documenting data, as we know from like sort of years of studying scientists who have produced data forever and then have only sort of documented it, right? Because it's extra labor, right? Like, so documenting data is sort of nobody's job frequently, and it's not super desirable. It's, it's kind of in the way of getting to your findings or your next, step along the path. And so, years of studying scientists have said people don't like documenting their data. It's very hard to make them do it. It's very hard. But like, what incentives do you think the folks creating data sets that are being utilized heavily in machine learning have for documenting that data, or how might we encourage them to do it more and better?
Yeah, it's something that I think about a lot because I think having looked at like data sheets that people have put out, like a lot of times there's really unsatisfactory answers to some of the questions. Like it's nice that they are being prompted to go through and reflect on these things, but you can kind of tell where some people were like, I don't have a good answer for this, or I'm just gonna like kind of wing it. And so there's documentation, but it might not be quality documentation, or it might just be that like some questions they couldn't answer themselves. And so, yeah, I guess there's been pushes for reproducibility as being part of a checklist for submitting papers to conferences. And I think it's just good practice for your own work. If you want to be able to reproduce your own results, you want to kind of remember what you were working with. But yeah, I think there's also like creating a role within a team for the data documenter could be an interesting move. Like if that were like a paid research assistant position for somebody on a research team, or if companies established a data documentation role. And I feel like I've seen that sort of thing coming up more, but yeah, I think really making it so that there's a person who is not burdened with other stuff can kind of really dedicate their resources and efforts to it. But I don't know if that's like a perfect solution, but yeah.
Yeah, I just read a really interesting article by Katie Pine, who's a professor at Arizona State, who's working in the health field, so a pretty different field. But she was observing a new profession of people who are tasked with data documentation in hospital systems and in health systems, because the incentives are there for hospitals to document their data well, because of the needs of billing and how complicated that is in the United States. And so there's a new profession emerging of sort of data professionals. But as her paper was pointing out, they document the data in particular ways that are basically tailored for billing, not for research, right? Not for research or accountability in sort of health outcomes. And so because that primary driver there is the need to be able to figure out how much money the hospital, it needs to is making. And so I was thinking about what the analogs might be in natural language processing or other sort of data documentation spaces where we have this real need for good data documentation. But like thinking about, well, if we did have people on teams doing this, what would their incentives be, and how would that impact how the data is understood, right? Like certain things are documented and not others, and it's a really interesting question, like to sort of think through like what would the outcomes be of aligning the incentives in various ways, right? Or having people's job be making good data, right? Usable, shareable data. How do we? Yeah. Anyway, I think it's really worth thinking about, and it's an exciting set of things to consider. You've talked a little bit, but I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about what's particularly hard or challenging about data practices within machine learning. You've mentioned just the difficulty of finding good data as a major challenge. Are there other sort of challenges to practicing good ethical machine learning?
Yeah, a lot. I guess with respect to data practices, another thing that's come up recently is that once, I guess like there's this cycle lately of there's a large data set that wasn't very carefully curated, and then somebody audits it and finds a lot of disturbing or unexpected contents in it, and then perhaps the data set becomes retired, and then people who still have copies of that data set somewhere might not know about this and might still have it, or they might know and still fail to delete and get rid of the data. And so I think it's very hard once a data set has been collected to make sure that it's gone forever if you want to get rid of it. I think there's a paper by Peng et al. That talks about the sort of issues with retiring data sets. And
I've sort of zombie data sets out there in the world. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I like sort of as a joke, but also as like a potentially earnest idea, I've thought about like, what if we created like a file format that expired over time so that it's just sort of like withered away, kind of like real documents, kind of, if you don't preserve them well, they just kind of wither away. But I don't know if that's practical. But yeah.
I mean, I think that even just the questions that would go into, thinking like, for instance, when you are creating data, thinking about the lifetimes of that data is not necessarily a question that one asks themselves now, right? Like, how long should this data exist? Should this, because, some data sets we'll need in 100 years, weather data and maybe traffic data. I think, right, we'll want to know that because we'll need that longitudinal data, or, archivists will want it, historians will want it, right? And some data, maybe not, right? And like, so what is the, yes. And so I actually think there are really hard questions here about how long should data live? And that having some sort of mechanism that asks people to ask those questions, right? To consider, like, is this long-lived data that you are producing, or is this like, should this go away? Right? It's a really good and interesting, both philosophical and ethical question to sort of ask of data creators.
Yeah, one of my first experiences in language technology was an internship with the Panlix project, which is part of the Long Now Foundation, and their whole philosophy is around like trying to ensure that aspects of human culture are preserved for very, very long amounts of time. And so I think with respect to like language data and preservation, that was kind of their MO. But yeah, I think there's even that could potentially cause ethical quandaries around like who gets to preserve linguistic resources and for whom and for what purpose. And then yeah, with things like photos of people or like data about people that they would rather keep private, yeah, that I think there's maybe more of a personal kind of aspect to it. Like, is my face on somebody's laptop somewhere just like sitting there in a data set with features of myself that I didn't realize they knew about me? Like, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It's interesting thinking about the differences between sort of my utterances, right, and modes of speaking online versus, right, my face or other sort of attributes about me, and like how, yeah, I mean, so I know you've talked and thought about privacy in your work. How do concepts of privacy apply to sort of linguistic data or uses of linguistic data? Is what we say private, so linguistics is not my area, so I'm very interested in sort of how you think about privacy as a piece of this puzzle, if at all.
Yeah, I guess that for me raises two things. One is that I think considering a lot of the history of like mostly, like, I guess with respect to like a lot of linguistic documentation of indigenous languages in the Americas, a lot of that data was collected by like universities or, settler researchers who then become like the sole owners of this really rich documentation. There was an article in the New Yorker last year about the Penobscot language and how like one white guy in Maine had basically all of the archives, and the tribe themselves were trying to revitalize their language, and they're like, can we have that back? And so, yeah, I think that kind of question of like, you can't really own a language, but you could have a lot of the important documentation and like, grammatical information or like collections of stories or myths or things that in a way becomes a resource that maybe you can own or keep private or like restrict who you give it to. But yeah, that I think it's a question that I'm also kind of still thinking about, like, even if you have like a small snapshot of a language, can you still extrapolate enough of the grammatical properties to then say, okay, I can build a translation system for this, or I can, build a parser for this. And then the other thing with like language and privacy, like I think I've talked about this before with a lot of people, is that there's a lot of like scraped blog data that lives in various language training data sets, because I think when you're trying to collect a lot of kind of casual speech, I think blogs seem very irresistible. And I'm pretty sure that one of my like middle school blogs made it into one of these data sets. And that's very humiliating to me. Like, I don't think that it's actually connectable back to me, but like the idea that all of my like angsty musings are in someone's like language model, I'm just like, oh, I can't. How do I get that back? I don't think I can, but
yes.
Yeah.
That goes back to this question of sort of longevity too, of like these, right? Like how long data should live from our sort of childhood selves and middle school selves, and right. And if they become part of these larger models, they may be around forever, but that was not our intention when we were middle schoolers writing those blogs, right? Like that you were not imagining this would be a resource about you forever.
Yeah. I mean, there's that sort of like, there's like obviously like anthropological interest to it, but yeah, while I am still alive and still building a career, I don't want anyone to know what I was thinking about in 2003 or whatever.
Yes. And so I think this gets to something that has been really important in our PERVADE discussions. That was sort of one of our sort of key findings has been that frequently when we say privacy, actually what we mean is power, right? And that around this kind of data, and that power and justice are really key concerns for people whose data is being used in research, right? And whether that's language data or other forms of data. And also that power and justice are key concerns for many of the researchers who are gathering and using pervasive forms of data, right? That we talk to researchers like you all the time who are sort of trying to parse this out. Like, can I use this data, right? And that's like a power question and a justice question. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you think about power and justice in your work?
Yeah, it's hard to come up with like a concise way to think about, or like to kind of verbalize this. I think even though there are a lot of really thoughtful frameworks for trying to do like co-design and participatory design, I still think like a small group of informants still doesn't necessarily speak for the entire, set of people that they're meant to represent. I think every individual has such a unique way of interacting with these systems that I don't think you can just check off, oh, we did this sort of consulting with people and now we're okay. So yeah, I think the people who are aware of, the people who are able to build and implement the systems and kind of ask the research questions hold a lot of the power. And I guess, yeah, I guess another aspect to that question, I think is informed by a lot of like my own like interest, I guess, activism in like, what are the material conditions affecting people in my current context? Like I try to give a lot of time to like mutual aid for like food and housing insecurity, and also like immigration where I live here in Seattle. And I think like all of my kind of reading of developments in the tech world is very shaped by like, how is this going to impact people who aren't necessarily, in the rooms at these tech companies asking the research questions or like making the decisions around what kind of data to collect and where and how. And like, I think there's a lot of really well-intentioned people who, want to build tools that work for everybody, but don't necessarily know, like, in practice, a lot of technology is being used to uphold oppression and not to like alleviate difficult conditions for people. So that's like a thing that I'm currently grappling with and still figuring out how to deal with in a way that I think is sustainable and like honors what I think is right. But yeah, I felt like that was kind of a convoluted answer.
No, I think that's helpful. I think, one of the key things we can do as researchers is tie our sort of it's not theoretical, but like the work we're doing every day in our sunny academic bubbles to work we do in other parts of our lives, as activists or as parents or as like all of the other sort of hats that we wear, and or as children, as people who may or may not be able-bodied, as people, like we need to bring those hats to our academic bubbles, and like because I think they help us spot issues, spot injustices, spot potential ways our texts, the things that we're building can be used and to perpetuate injustices. So I think I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually think that sort of multiple identities, like, there was a long time in which science was supposed to be done without any identity, and that's done, right? Like we're past that now, which is good. And so like, why not bring those like as a part of our toolkit to sort of spot like things we could be doing differently or better within tech development.
Yeah, and I think a lot of like the work in sort of capital letters just can't happen in academia just by the virtue of what it is and how it operates in the world. Like I think, yeah, I'm glad that we are able to bring our concerns and identities to the space, but I do think that also sometimes a lot of the work really just is meant to happen elsewhere and happens better there. So
yes, yeah. Yes, right. That right. Building new language technologies isn't necessarily going to solve these other problems, right? And so, yeah, that's right. And so we need to spend our time there as well, right? In other contexts. Agreed. Another sort of challenging thing for the PERVADE's been grappling with, and I wanted to ask you about, because I think it's particularly challenging in sort of large language sets, is the idea. So one of the things that PERVADE has been finding is that online participants, people who are participating online in various ways, still see consent as the gold standard for their data to be used in research. But of course, consent is not practical and feasible in many kinds of research done with online data and digital data these days. But what we've been finding is that forms of awareness may be like the next best option, right? To people still would like to be asked for consent, but it's not always practical. It's not always possible. But that helping people be aware of large forms of data collection is a piece of this puzzle. And I wondered how you think about awareness and consent to language data collection. Do you think people are aware of the extent to which, say, their blog posts may be used in machine learning development? Are there ways we could make people more aware?
Yeah, I'll say, I think Casey Fiesler has a lot of interesting work on these questions. And then, yeah, in terms of like awareness, I think anecdotally, I think everybody who uses social media on some level has experienced like really eerily on point recommendations or ads. And so I think we all have this passive awareness that something is happening behind the scenes. They're collecting something about me. And it may not be as cut and dry as like the microphone is on and they're recording my conversations. There's just these like massive networks of data brokers all working together, or not necessarily together, but like collecting all of this data at such a scale that like they don't even need to have the microphone on. Like they can just kind of like use all this data to infer all these things about you and your network. And so I think people have some passive awareness that something's going on. And I think like when, these big headlines came out about like Cambridge Analytica and those, things, I think that really raised more awareness around like every time you use your phone, something is going on behind the scenes. The thing that kind of concerns me is that it's become so normalized that I think younger people have become kind of resigned to this notion that if I want to talk to my friends, I have to just give up some of my data. Like there's, terms and agreements and whatnot, and people just kind of like don't want to feel burdened by reading all of it, or they'll say like, yeah, I just want to be able to talk to my friends, like take my data if you have to. But yeah, I guess it sort of concerns me that I think people have become more resigned to it. And I think the narrative, I think like to the extent that like tech companies can kind of like shape that narrative, they're kind of saying like, oh, we're giving you connection to your family in exchange for this. Like we're providing something that allows you to build relationships with people. And I think people kind of want to believe that. And so even if they are kind of aware or like passively consenting to having their data collected, they're like, I just want to be able to talk to my cousin on a different continent. Like, I don't know if I have to sacrifice my privacy for that, then I'm willing to do it. And I think that's, yeah, in a way, it makes me kind of sad, but also like, I don't really know. I guess that's more of like a policy question that can be kind of addressed with like shaping laws or policies at like a more national level. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is increasing interest, interestingly, right now for policy that would, I mean, obviously there's sort of privacy policy in the works sort of in Congress and also at the state level, but then also I've been really interested in several pieces of proposed legislation which are talking about creating archives of specifically social media data. So not necessarily blogs, although how one defines social media is actually a big question, right? Here, like what's the line, right? Dating apps, blogs, like maybe not, but maybe. And so creating these repositories that would be accessible by researchers, partially because researchers are seen as having sort of a disadvantage in terms of data access to, online data, right? These companies have much more access to language data and image data and all kinds than researchers do, but also to sort of keep companies accountable. That's why this is being explored as a legal option. We can understand better how their advertising algorithms work, and so it would be, but the making research data more available to researchers, I think, comes with all kinds of questions about, is this what people signed up for, right? Like, did they know that we would be making this available? Who gets to keep all of this data, right? Like, so there are a lot of logistical questions, but it strikes me that for somebody like you who's interested in data documentation, good data documentation and good data practices, that a professionalized model for holding on to so much of this data would actually be really positive, right? If we can imagine an archive with archival practices around documenting data that comes in and like understanding what's here, that it could be a sort of a moment to professionalize like good data practices. So it seems like an interesting possibility. It's hard to tell if it will happen. It's hard to tell what kinds of resources would be available for it, but it's interesting to imagine an archive of social media data for researchers and what that would look like and what that would enable.
Yeah, I mean, I think people like having themselves reflected back in a way that they felt they've opted into. Like, I don't know if you've done like Spotify Unwrapped, but people love that. Yes. They're like, oh, yes. Like I've generated this massive stream of data about myself, and now I can at the end of the year reflect on like what my musical personality is. So I think people like, I mean, when they feel like they can like opt into it and like share it with friends in a way that's like fun and whimsical, I think like if there was like a museum of social media that kind of like showcased interesting moments that were anonymized, I think people would actually like that. But I'm sure people would also feel somewhat uncomfortable if they recognize themselves, or if they were like, these are really intimate moments that have happened incidentally, like on Facebook, but that like I feel sort of like a voyeur reading it. But yeah, that kind of reminds me, like I used to, when I was in high school, I used to like find notes left behind from people who would pass notes in class, and like I would be like, what were they talking about? And I would like, not know who they were from. But yeah, I feel like that happens less now, that people just kind of text each other. But if you were able to kind of like see an anonymized conversation that happened over text, it's kind of like I don't know, I think people find it cute when you can kind of see like how relatable other people are.
Yeah. No, right. Yeah, I mean, you can see just like the academic potential for it, the machine learning potential for something like this is huge, I think. Yeah, it's a good point. I like your point about people seeing their data reflected back to them. I actually think that this is a part of the awareness puzzle too, right? Like there's this we're getting some of our digital selves reflected back to us through the advertising and through, you know, the like targeting of ads, but there are other mechanisms for reflecting back. And I think about, all right, like a chat bot that sounds like me, right? Or that like sounds like somebody I know, or, you know, like that kind of like reflecting back is another just nice piece of like how we can help build awareness of like how these systems work and what they're using and like the kinds of data that are contributing, that the outputs of these systems are a piece of that puzzle. Let's turn a little bit to method in your research, and specifically how you found you can turn sort of reflection on power or awareness or good data practices into research methods in your work. Like, how do you incorporate those practices?
So that's definitely something I'm still figuring out. I think a lot of methods that I've kind of stumbled on were not necessarily available to me through my disciplinary training, and were things that I kind of stumbled on through taking a seminar or going to a talk and incidentally being like, oh, there's this whole body of literature that I just never was introduced to formally. And so I feel like I've been kind of trying to teach myself a lot of things, and I feel a lot of I guess I don't know what the right word to use is here, but I feel sort of like a dilettante, if that's the right way to say that, where I think I've been trying to engage more with like HCI methods and more with like STS practices and methods. And like, I feel like a lot of it has been me just kind of asking around people or taking a class here or there, but not really feeling like I'm doing it right. Yeah, I think
as somebody trained in STS methods, I'm constantly feeling like I'm not doing it right. I think that's normal. But I know what you mean.
And I guess maybe that's kind of part of it too, is that like we're sort of naturally trying to reflect as we try these things out. Like I think people who are inclined towards such methods are naturally going to be kind of self-reflexive people who are even like, yeah, questioning like, am I doing this right? Like, how can I continue to evolve along these lines? So yeah, that's definitely something I'm still figuring out. I think among the frameworks I've tried to read about in my sort of limited understanding, like I think design justice has been one of the few that really tries to call out explicitly I guess the term they use is the matrix of oppression as something that we want to design against. I think there's kind of this like spectrum of like frameworks that are a little bit more flexible or a little bit more kind of not prescriptive, and then there's others that are like, these are, you know, really there are material conditions in the world that exist because of history and we can explicitly call them out and design against them. And so yeah, I'm trying to kind of like figure out in the spectrum of different frameworks and ways of thinking about things, like what can I use in my own work and to what extent.
Yes, yeah, I think that's really fascinating and useful. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about different design frameworks come out of HCI, like value sensitive design, which sort of, you know, is a very, how would I characterize it? You know, it's about the value, like, you know, everybody has values and we look at a community and then we try and figure out, and then contrasting that against something like design justice, right? Which is about like, no, it's not necessarily about what the group of people you're talking to want, but is this, right, there's this like historical and material conditions, and that's what we're trying to grapple with in our design practice. And, you know, you can see the relationship between these two frameworks, but they're actually quite different, I think, right, in how you would apply them as method. And then I think as we get to learning technologies, there's like a third question which comes up about like, well, how do we know it's work? You know, like how do we then translate values and or politics to outcomes, to benchmarks, to outcomes, to like, because I think thinking about the design of learning, like we've had 30 years of thinking about the design of sort of interface technologies through HCI lenses, but we haven't had that like 30 years of learning technologies, and they're different, right? Like their design practices are different for these technologies, and also like sort of what we can, like the outcomes and outputs are different. And so like trying to figure out how to translate some of those practices in ways that make sense for learning technologies is, I think, a really interesting project, and like one that I'm excited that people like you are working on. So I like seeing sort of how that's happening. Do you have a sense of where the sort of the state of norms or agreement about best practices for data ethics in language learning communities? Like, do you have a sense of an emerging consensus?
So I think my collaborators, Emily Bender and Angie McMillan-Major, have done a lot of work on like establishing and iterating on data statements specifically for natural language processing. And I think the community has like really benefited from this work. And I think I'm increasingly seeing people trying to engage with best practices for documenting language data and language models. And kind of like, it's interesting. Like, I think because it's relatively new within the field to have such a resource, like, I think there's a lot of learning underway of like, how do people respond to this, both the practice of creating documentation and the practice of receiving documentation. And like I mentioned earlier, like I think having looked at various examples of data statements, like there's some that just kind of seem to be, you know, winging it on some of the questions, or like not really sure how to answer a question, or just kind of like, yeah. And I think anecdotally, I think people have stuff that they do want to report, but there isn't like a neat space within the statement to add that. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to see like, how can this resource evolve over time, the more people actually use it and try to put it into practice. And yeah, I guess the other thing, I think maybe because of where I am both institutionally and like just in my sort of social networks, like I think because of like who I collaborate with and being at University of Washington, like I think there's a lot more kind of cross-pollination and like acceptance of these new practices or relatively new practices. But I think I'm curious, like, you know, within the global language technology community, like how are people receiving these new, or not new, but these practices, or like, are people receptive to it, or are there different ideas around what is ethical or what is important to surface with respects to data documentation? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, maybe my perspective is limited. It is limited. So yeah. And I guess like another thing, so now that I'm in the School of Medicine working with more health informatics people, like I'm kind of learning more about like within the US, medicine has a little bit more history of trying to establish research ethics guidelines, and seeing how that community talks about things versus how like language technology and machine learning talk about things. There's a lot of kind of ways in which I think machine learning is kind of stumbling along a similar path where there has been work done before. And again, maybe this could be my limited perspective on like what conversations are happening, but I feel like there's a lot of potential for like machine learning to learn from some of the difficulties faced by the medical community in trying to like grapple with its own history of racism and exploitation. And like I think the medical community obviously is still dealing with a lot of ethical issues, but has had, I guess, maybe a 40-year head start on trying to establish more norms around research practice and ethics. So yeah, that's something I'm kind of learning about too.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. That's very interesting. I wanted to just note for participants, you are welcome at any point to use the Q&A box to ask questions, and I will make sure they get asked. Can you think of resources that might make this process that you're identifying of sort of, you know, getting a jump on identifying best practices, coming to consensus around best practices easier for machine learning practitioners and researchers?
Yeah, I guess, do you mean resources for like how to start tackling ethical questions, or like resources for putting into practice some of these?
Oh, either would be great to hear about, if there's, yeah, one or the other strikes you.
Yeah, I guess everyone kind of learns differently. I find that I get a lot out of like reading journalism and reading books. Like I think in terms of like kind of learning from the history of like medicine and medical anthropology, reading about like Henrietta Lacks and her cell line becoming this like really widely used resource without her or her family having known. Like I think looking at that history and like what shaped it and what its impact was, I think, and then trying to draw analogies to like how we're using research subject on data in machine learning, I think could be a really productive avenue for like thinking through, okay, like what can we learn from this? And I guess in terms of like resources to support like putting things into practice, yeah, like taking advantage of existing documentation. I guess I often plug work by Swabha Swayamdipta on dataset cartography, which is like a method for surfacing like difficult instances in machine learning training data, particularly for like natural language processing. And I think like taking advantage of, because like it is difficult to like manually comb through an entire data set to try to document what's in it or like what are the problematic instances. And so making use of like algorithmic or statistical properties of the data can help you spotlight like, okay, here's like what the average instance kind of looks like. Here's what some edge cases might look like. Are there any interesting properties that maybe have to do with like linguistic facets, or like, is there something in the content? But yeah, I think making use of tools like that can really help kind of ease the pain of trying to produce documentation from scratch. But yeah.
It's a fantastic term. Data set cartography. It's beautiful. I love that. No, those are great examples. I think that's really, really helpful. Are there sort of issues you see coming down the pipe in the data ethics and algorithmic ethics space that we should be talking about more, or that you sort of hope to be paying attention to soon?
Something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is like how we should think about our data. And I think this is like a conversation that's going on in various different disciplines, but like, because of how online a lot of us are, just kind of by virtue of needing to be, especially with the last few years of the pandemic, like so much of our behavior is digitized and available to whoever has been collecting that data. And so I think a space that I'm interested in following right now is like theorizing, like what should we call that, or like what can we make of those relationships? Like, are we doing labor by producing data, or should we be considered, I guess somebody told me about research on considering people like shareholders in a business because our data is so valuable. And so kind of like theorizing the political economy of data is an interesting space for me lately, like I guess digital data, because
yes,
like I think increasingly, because the pandemic really like illustrated how much we can just do online, like this webinar, like I think there's no going back, like everything is going to be increasingly online, and thus more and more of our behavior is going to be digitized. And I think it's urgent to kind of theorize, like, what are the implications of that? And like, what can we do to make sure that it doesn't become, unbearable?
Yes. Yes, I think that's really, really important. Whose is this data? Who benefits from this data? Yes, and what does a world look like in which there's a more just set of benefits that come out of this kind of interaction, or the capture of this kind of interaction, right? Like we're getting benefits from this interaction now, but it's also being captured in various ways that we do not have pipelines into, or we don't see into. So yes, who gets that? Can we democratize it? Oh, that's a great question. My last question, I want to know a little bit more about sort of what's next for you. So you have a new postdoc, or new-ish postdoc, I guess. What are you working on? Sort of what's exciting you for your future work?
Lately, I've been thinking a lot about kind of the intersection of language technology and healthcare. And I think where this comes up a lot in my recent like readings and connections with people is, at least within the US context, there's a lot of linguistic and cultural barriers to healthcare for people who have limited English proficiency. And so increasingly, like technology is coming to play a role there, where like if interpreters aren't available, using translation tools. And I think Niloufar Salehi at UC Berkeley has like a new project in the space that I'm excited to see what comes out of that. And I forget what this organization is called, but I've seen there's an organization that makes a tool that has like preloaded translations for very common phrases in the medical space, so that you know that you're getting a quality, accurate translation that's been vetted by a human. Because like it's one of those really high stakes scenarios where you don't want a mistranslation or like a cultural insensitivity to happen. And so that's something I'm interested in like continuing to learn more about. And yeah, I guess as we talked about earlier, figuring out like what's a good design framework to bring into that space that can, you know, inform how to understand like what people's needs are and like how to build tools in a way that reflects the values of the people who are going to be most impacted. So yeah, that's kind of where my mind is lately.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating and valuable. That's yeah, for some language technologies in the healthcare space had not sort of, that intersection hadn't occurred to me as a point like of, yeah, and what a useful, interesting place to be thinking about data documentation, how data is used, practices. That's fascinating. I love it. Well, thank you. This has been just super illuminating, super interesting. I'm really glad we got a chance to chat today. And thanks for being part of this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk.
It was a pleasure. Take care.